I'm originally from the United States, but I've been working in Bergen for the last, 35 years or so. Most of that time working on the light rail project, from the very idea of the project through its planning and implementation. We opened in 2010 with the first stage, and it got to the airport in 2017. We're opening another stage later this year, and eventually we're going to the north to Osama. There's been a lot of discussion in Bergen, you might have seen in the newspapers, about whether to go through the city center in a daylight section or running in a tunnel. So we've been working on that. It's very interesting. What I'd like to talk about today is what's happening in the world with a focus on public transportation. We've had a COVID crisis, which has led to a lot of changes in the way people move around. We've had a tremendous reduction in the number of people traveling by public transportation, both because of practical reasons that they're working from home, but also because of the fear of being infected and getting the COVID virus themselves. I'd like to start with a little bit of a definition of what is anarchy, because the topic of today's event is anarchy and change. And the words that they associate with anarchy are pretty negative, actually. Lawlessness, absence of government, nihilism, mobocracy, revolution, insurrection, riot, rebellion, mutiny, disorder, disorganization, misrule, chaos, tumult, turmoil, mayhem, pandemonium. Sounds pretty scary, actually, all those things. But the main definition says a state of disorder due to the absence or non-recognition of authority or other controlling systems. And this is where the transportation professionals, the planners, and the engineers get into the picture, because they're actually the authority. They're the ones that are advising the politicians who actually make the end decisions on how we adjust to these things. They're the ones that are able to come up with solutions and to work on the problems, the challenges of the problems. So what's happened? We have had COVID. We also have a background of a climate crisis, the global climate changes that are happening, which transportation is a very large contributor to the gases that cause climate change. But because of COVID, that's the most immediate thing. There's been a lot of reduction in the number of people traveling. And this goes for all forms of transportation, whether it be public transportation, even automobile use has gone down to a certain extent, although there was a transition when people were using private cars instead of public transportation, and it largely kept the levels of road traffic the same levels as before the COVID crisis. But in general, it's been more of a crisis for public transportation to try to maintain the same sorts of services that we had before the COVID crisis hit us. And there have been changes of rules, how we deal with each other, how do we work together. Working from home, to a large extent, went over to digital tools such as Zoom and Teams and Skype. And we were living, I think, on a little bit of a surplus of knowing who we were working with from before, that it was easy to make the transition. The trouble now, after 2 years, is we're starting to meet new people, and for the first time we're meeting people via digital screen chats and things. And we don't have the background, we don't have that history, the backstory of working together with these people from before. So I think one of the challenges there is to try to keep the level of creativity. We heard about creativity earlier with having different ways of thinking. When we're using these tools, we've already limited to a certain group of people who are capable of communicating using these different digital work tools. So that's an interesting thing that is, I think, is a big challenge for the future. I was reading an article in the New York Times about how one person was coping with the changes in societal actions. And she had 3 words that she used: tea, fire, and hiking. And what that meant was that every day she would take time to have tea with her dearest friends to try to keep connections to people. Fire, she had a backyard where she could have an outdoor fire pit. And she did the same things in the evenings, where she would have a fire and we would invite friends over in the open air and be able to have some communication, some societal interaction. And hiking, she was getting out and trying to exercise more. I think that there's been a lot of more emphasis on health during this period of time, not just to avoid disease, but to try to build immunity for the future through physical activity. And as I said, everything behind all these things is this global crisis of climate change that's sort of a background for this. How do we address issues of transportation with regard to the changes that are happening? A lot of what I'm talking about also has to do with an urban situation. It's in the urban context of cities. And one of the great philosophers, if you will, transportation planners, urban planners, was Jane Jacobs, who wrote the book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And one of the things that she said, and she meant, was that chaos and a lot of different groups or different activities in an urban setting was a good thing. This is what kept livable cities attractive, that we didn't want them to be homogenous. And I think we lose a little bit of that when we have the changes that are happening, but the chaos of the situation, the changes that are happening actually creates these opportunities and makes for an attractive situation. One of the situations we're in now is what's going to happen in the future? How do we predict an uncertain future? And as a planner, we have two ways of thinking. We can predict and provide. This is usually done with trends. We see that traffic, for example, is going up, and we have to provide bigger roads, more roads, for example, different kinds of transportation systems. The other thing we can do, though, is plan and prevent. That we find a goal that we want to get to and try to design systems that will meet that goal. And I think in the context of the global crisis, this is very important. We have to find out where we want to be. And I think a lot of the goals, for example, of these different climate treaties is to reduce the growth of climate gases, for example, to take it down to a much lower level. And then you have to enact policies that will enable you to reach those goals. There's a different way of thinking. When I first came to Norway and to Bergen, the general way of doing things was just 3% growth. How do we handle that? And there was no conception of where that would lead us to. That a 3% growth over a 20-year period is a doubling or tripling of the number of, for example, vehicles operating on the roads, or the number of people moving by public transportation. The question now is, what's going to happen? Are we going to go back to what's a normal situation? The situation before COVID in March of 2020, yeah, 2 years ago. Or do we have a new normal where people are largely working from home or working from home some days? Does that mean, does that affect the demand for transportation? And will these changes that might happen or will happen, how will they affect, for example, working practices? I talked a little bit about that surplus we had of personal interactions, where people knew other people from before. So making a transition to digital meetings was not really a big deal. But we find in these digital meetings, it's very hard to do things like brainstorming, to be creative, to come with new ideas, to be able to bring everybody into the group. There's always someone who sits in the back lurking, really doesn't want to be part of an exchange, a little bit shy, if you will. That's harder to do when you're in a physical meeting, I think, than when you're in a digital meeting, especially when people turn their cameras off or turn their microphones on mute. Will we be working from home more in the future? A lot of people think that gives them freedom. But one of the things about working from home, or working not in an office, is that you're expected to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But working from home means that they can call you into a meeting at 9 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock in the morning. And if they call you on the telephone or send you an email, they expect immediate responses. You have a reduced level of accidental meetings, if you will, unplanned interactions, meeting at the coffee machine with somebody who you don't usually talk to, and finding that they're involved in something you're interested in, or they have an idea about what you should be interested in. Those things disappear if you're working from home. As I mentioned, you have an increase in working hours. You're always basically on the job if you're working from home, working remotely. Will this mean an increase or a decrease in the general trend toward urbanization? Will people want to move out of urban centers or move into urban centers? It's an interesting question. And the final point I'll mention is this change of social equality. The people who are best able to work from home, to work digitally, are the ones that are already well off. The people that work at McDonald's or at the gasoline stations or whatever, they have to go to work. They can't work from home. And they tend to be the people that have less of a standing in the socioeconomic system that we have. So this increases the distance between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. What's happening as far as change goes is we see this change, as I mentioned, availability, accessibility, that people can work wherever they are, can work whenever they want to. We're also seeing a slight shift toward more private automobiles, and this is exacerbated by the electric vehicles, because people can now drive electric cars and feel that they're not doing any harm to the environment. And so it's sort of an environmental contribution for them to drive their car instead of taking, for example, public transport. But that's a big change. There's a lot of focus now, not on transportation, but on mobility. We see the rise of this last mile type activity, such as the electric scooters that are taking over our city centers. People are trying to get from, not from A to B, but that last part from B to C or whatever, and using different forms of transport. And in order for those systems to work, they require an awful lot of information, digital information, about availability, about travel times, and those sorts of things. We're seeing an increased or change in consumer behavior, that people buying things in shops, especially larger ticket items, they're buying things on the internet, which creates a new transportation challenge in the distribution of goods. How do you distribute all these packages? In urban areas especially, do you use large vehicles, do you use electric vehicles? In Bergen we have some bicycle type vehicles that are delivering packages from DHL and Bring. We see changes in technology. We see electrification. I mentioned electric cars. I've worked an awful lot lately on electric buses, both battery buses and the trolley bus line in Bergen. We see the ferries in Norway all being electrified. This is a big change as well. It creates a lot of different challenges. And then, as I said, there's more of a focus now on health, outdoor activities. This is the world over as well. That walking and cycling especially. And cycling also has been aided by technology here with the introduction of electric bicycles also. So that makes for a big change. Finally, I'd just like to just touch on what this means in terms of challenges and what are the opportunities to be addressed here. And how do we avoid anarchy and just have positive change? That's basically what I'm trying to hit on here. And also this gives us the opportunity, as I mentioned, to do changes in our transportation systems that will establish goals with regard to climate change. So again, it goes back to this predict and provide or plan and prevent, that we can plan for a future and prevent the global crisis from becoming worse anyway. We need to find new solutions. We need to find solutions that are environmentally sustainable. And this isn't just for work, but it has to do with leisure activities, it goes for shopping activities, our entire activities we do in life. We need to establish better ways of having this micro-mobility to get that last mile covered. We need to do different ways of distributing goods and services to people. And finally, I'd like to do something about the social interaction, the equality. When people travel by public transport, it's a way for them to understand people from other ways of life. It's a melting pot, if you will, of different groups coming together. Whereas when people are driving in the private automobile, they're isolated from the rest of society. I think it's very important for people to have that interaction, to meet on a sort of a level playing field where they can understand each other. I think this United World College is a perfect example of that also, where people are meeting and interacting with people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And I think it's also important, not just for the socioeconomic in a sort of global point of view, but I think it's also for the individual point of view, it's important for us to find solutions which allow us to separate our work lives from our private lives. If the two are intermeshed, if the work life takes over, and we don't have an opportunity to have a private life with the families that we hopefully love and enjoy being with, it can be a real problem for society. That's what I'll leave you with as the last thought. Thank you very much for your attention.